Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the museum's Facebook Live series. I'm your host, historian Edna Friedberg. During each program, we examine a different aspect of Holocaust history and its relevance to our world today. The much-anticipated release of the movie Black Widow last week reminds us how much audiences love superheroes. We never seem to tire of the battle between good and evil. But in fact, many of the superheroes that we root for today are the very same characters who were first introduced in comic books of the 1940s. Today, we'll look back in time to examine the origins of this art form, to see how it helped to spread awareness about World War II, Hitler and the Nazis, and why it took so many years for the industry to explicitly depict the horrors of the Holocaust and the identity of its Jewish victims. I'm honored today to be joined by two comic book fans and experts, Eli Rosenbaum, the Director of Human Rights Enforcement at the U.S. Department of Justice, who has spent 4 decades hunting Nazis and their collaborators, and Samantha Baskind, Professor of Art History at Cleveland State University and the editor of the foundational volume on Jewish graphic novels. Welcome, Eli, and welcome, Samantha.
Thank you, Edna.
Good to be with you, Edna.
During today's program, viewers, please post your questions for Eli and Samantha in the comments section, and we'll get to as many of them during the course of the live show as we have time for. So, Samantha, I'd like to begin with you. The comic book industry was born in the United States in the 1930s, around the same time that Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany. Who was creating these comics, and what were they hoping to achieve?
In the early years, comics were funnies in the newspaper. The comic books began with Jewish American artists. Many were living in Brooklyn, New York, and they couldn't get hired in other professions because of anti-Semitism. So these Jewish artists were the driving force behind the comic book industry, and they originated the superheroes who fought evil. And this was beginning with Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who were the creators of Superman. Even before the US joined the Allies in World War II, comic superheroes led this fictional fight against Hitler and the Nazis. Nazis were real-life villains, not fictional foils like Lex Luthor. Captain America was conceived as a direct response to the rise of Nazi Germany and American isolationism. He was specifically created to fight the Nazis by 2 Jewish men, Jack Kirby, who was born Jacob Kurtzberg, and Joe Simon. And you can see here in this cover, Captain America was introduced in March 1941, which was 9 months before America entered World War II. In this debut issue, Captain America, who's decked out in red, white, and blue, gives Hitler a right jab to the face in what is Jack Kirby's classic cinematic style.
From the very first issue, Captain America is designed as the anti-Nazi superhero. I'd like us to take a look at another cover that shows how some other superheroes very quickly followed Captain America's lead in going after Hitler. The look of fear in Hitler's eyes here is absolutely priceless. Walk us through what we're looking at here, Samantha.
This is Daredevil. It's July 1941, and Daredevil was a very short-lived character. All of the stories in this issue are about Daredevil's attempts to thwart Hitler. And as is common in comic books, the use of Technicolor is eye-catching and would really pop on a newsstand.
Absolutely. And we had the privilege of speaking with a renowned comic book artist and educator, Adam Kubert, who you will learn soon comes from an illustrious comic book family. Adam Kubert explains the enduring appeal of going after Hitler in particular, kind of the iconic villain of all time. Let's hear from Adam.
The hero is only as good as the villain that he fights. To me, there is no greater villain than Hitler, who, for whatever reason, wants to take over the world in a terrible, terrible way. That's something, that makes a good story. As far as Hitler and the Nazis, that's a low-hanging fruit. You put a swastika on something, immediately it sets the tone for the story and for the hero. It's an easy way to involve a reader or a movie viewer. into the story. If the antagonist is that evil, in my mind, you couldn't find a more evil personification of a human being.
And we still see that to this day, that Hitler, the Nazi swastika are very quickly recognizable shorthand for evil. But I'm also struck thinking as a historian about the ways that Hitler was kind of dismissed too easily, the threat that he and his regime represented because of the easy way that it was to cartoon him. I'd like to take a moment to thank our viewers who are joining us from all around the country and around the world. Good morning to you in Tullahoma, Tennessee, Cary, North Carolina, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Vernon Hills, Illinois, Michigan Bluff Dale, Texas, Atlanta, Georgia, Kansas City, Missouri. And hello to our international viewers who are watching from England, India, the Philippines, and Uganda. We're so glad that you are all with us. Eli, I'd like to bring you into the conversation now. Now, it's understandable, as we just saw from the examples that Samantha described to us, that Hitler was and continues to be portrayed as one of the worst villains, the uber villain in comics. But it could be a little more tricky to understand that even though many of the people behind the comic book industry in the 40s were in fact Jewish, they did not explicitly mention the Holocaust or the Jewish identity of the Nazis' primary targets in their wartime works. Why was this the case?
Well, after World War I, anti-Semitism, isolationism, and xenophobia were pervasive in our country, especially after the Great Depression brought widespread suffering to the United States. There was a huge spike in anti-Semitism after World War I, which, as an outstanding recent Holocaust Museum exhibition documented, actually skyrocketed during World War II. Many American Jews were worried that they would be blamed for the United States entering a war that would kill large numbers of American service members. Of course, the U.S. didn't enter World War II to save the Jews, but rather joined the war in response to Japan's 1941 attack at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and Germany's subsequent declaration of war against our country. So while this involves some speculation, I think there was concern among Jewish comic creators and publishers about drawing attention to Jewish victimization by the Nazis for fear of exacerbating domestic anti-Semitism, a scourge that so many of the creators had experienced personally in New York City and elsewhere. This reluctance to portray or even reference Jewish victimization by the major publishers endured for decades. There were occasional exceptions by smaller publishers, most famously the 1955 story Master Race by Bernie Krigstein in the EC comic book Impact. A 2018 article in a major newspaper asserted that, quote, comics were the first to depict the Shoah, that is the Holocaust. In fact, major publishers' comic books were the last significant art form to do so, years after motion pictures, to some extent television, certainly novels, painting, sculpture, et al. Had addressed the subject. One explanation that's been given was that because some Americans, especially children readers, hadn't met Jews or didn't know of any Jews, the creators and publishers wanted to avoid a situation in which their readers' first encounter with Jews was seeing them portrayed as mass murder victims in comics, that is, comics that depicted the real history. In 2006, noted comics artist Evan Dorkin, I'm a huge fan, satirized this reluctance by drawing a brilliant, sardonic 4-panel strip in which an imperiled Jewish man cries out during the war to the superheroes to save the Jews of Europe. And he pleads that, you superheroes were created by Jews, so surely you'll do something to save us. But the superheroes reply that they are too busy fighting regular crimes, bank robbers, etc., back home to intervene.
And Eli, we have an audience comment from a viewer named Sue that's consistent with some of what you're saying. She writes that comics were very patriotic for kids. During the World War II, my brother and I felt somewhat reassured that Hitler would be defeated, that it was an unsettling time for kids, and that she found the comic books comforting. But I'm also struck, I'm certainly not a comic book expert. I've been learning a lot through our prep of the show, but I know a lot about the US during this time. And the comic book authors and artists were really consistent with the mindset of the United States, even once the US enters the war. However, we might like to look back at it now as US troops, of course, as liberators of Nazi camps. That was never the military objective. We entered the war in order to defeat Japan and Germany and the Axis alliance, and the rescue of Jews was incidental. Let's look a little bit at how that played out in comics, because superheroes were instead fighting against threats to democracy, like this character, Captain Nazi. Eli, could you tell us about this, please?
Captain Nazi. Well, first of all, I mean, the viewer comment is right on target, of course. The comics, and especially through their covers, which you could see at newsstands all over America, helped drive support for the war effort, helped remind the country of the evil that we were fighting against. And these comic books, by the way, were shipped in huge quantities to our fighting forces in Europe and in the Pacific. And it helped bolster their morale. But as part of this effort, the creators created lots of villainous Nazi characters. Captain Nazi here is one of them. He was an arch enemy of Captain Marvel, who you see on the left, the biggest selling superhero of the war, not Superman, who was, however, the first superhero. And there were others like Red Skull, who fought against Captain America, or I should say Captain America fought against him. Fictional battles, but important. And here, of course, is the guy in the blue tights, the most famous superhero of all, Superman. And he is also fighting the Nazis, as did virtually all the superheroes during World War II.
So we see here a mixture of really inspired but still fictional villains and real villains. Eli, we have a viewer named Sasha who's asking, how were comic book artists at that time influenced by news coming out of Europe? Could you briefly respond to that?
Again, I think that requires some speculation. But it has to have been the case that reading during the war, especially from 1942 and 43 onward, stories in the press, again, especially in New York, where most of the creators were, about mass murder of Jews, shocking stories, could only have inspired people like Jack Kirby and Joe Simon and so many of the others to redouble their efforts to portray in the comic books valiant efforts by American superheroes to do battle with the Nazis and of course to depict the Nazis as the monstrous evil that they were.
Let's take a look, in fact, at one comic book artist who went against the grain and directly illustrated the plight of European Jews much earlier than most of his peers. Joe Kubert was the father of Adam Kubert, who we just heard from, and we're seeing here a picture of the late and great Joe Kubert. Samantha, please tell us about this man, this artist, and who he was, what he did.
Joe Kubert was another Jewish comics maker. He was a pioneer in the comics book industry. He was born in Poland in 1926, and he was just a few months old when he immigrated to New York with his parents and his older sister. And from a very young age, he wanted to make comics. He was a teenager when photographs and newsreels of Nazi crimes and inhumanity were revealed after the war ended and concentration camps were liberated. And he became one of the first artists to bring this reality into comics. In fact, he was just a teenager when he wrote his first story about this topic, which is called The Golem. It was a comics version of the centuries-old Jewish folktale of a protector of the Jewish people made of clay. We can see this here. This is from Challenger number 3, 1946. And in this story, Hubert depicts the plight of Jews in Nazi Europe and the 2 millennia of anti-Semitism prior to the Nazi genocide of Jews. We pulled out 2 panels from the Golem. And so these visuals are really interesting because Hubert does not shy away from the fact that this is a Jewish story, which is a rarity at the time. He tells the story of the Nazis bent on wholesale extermination. Again, he doesn't shy away from violence or particulars. That he has a Nazi use the word Jew is an anomaly. For decades, it's an anomaly. So war comics of this period were not usually read by young children, but rather by older readers. They're often those that are serving in the military.
And Eli, I know you're quite the comic book collector. I understand that you have a copy of the issue which included Kubert's Golem story. Could you tell us about the Challenger series?
Sure, that's right. Here you see me with issue number 3 of the Challenger and some other Holocaust-related comics that I've collected over the years. The Challenger was an early post-war comic book published by an entity called the Interfaith Committee of Protestant Digest, which was located in Manhattan. Each issue, 66 pages for a dime, included several comic stories, and the back page included a call to action, which we see here, a call to action to young readers to fight hatred and intolerance by taking this pledge. And the pledge includes the words, "Those who would destroy us seek first to defeat us by setting Gentile against Jew, white against Negro, faith against faith. I hereby join hands with the youth of the world in its fight against fascism and bigotry, and by doing so declare myself a challenger." It's important to note that this comic series obviously was not produced by a major publisher, or just as obviously by a Jewish publisher, but they get credit for publishing, I believe, the very first American comic book to address the horrors of the Holocaust. Kudos to Robert Bernstein, who's believed to have written it, and of course Joe Kubert, whose amazing art illustrated it. Unfortunately, the series was not commercially successful. There were only 4 issues produced. Joe Kubert's work appeared in 3 of them.
I'm really struck looking at this extraordinary artifact, that it's a matter of meeting the kids where they are, basically, sort of the way that we sometimes put more serious content on Instagram or Snapchat or other places today, that you have to go where the kids hang out. But once they're there, you know, teenagers are serious thinkers. They're smart, and you can appeal to them on a lot of levels. And if the collector in me, forgive me, the edition points out that, at least in my opinion, this is the most important and also the rarest Holocaust-related comic known to exist. There are very few surviving copies. Part of the reason for that is, as you mentioned, it was not a commercially successful venture. Samantha, I'm curious along those lines, how long did it take then for more mainstream popular comic books to include Holocaust history and to explicitly identify that most of those killed were Jews?
It took decades. The mainstream comic book industry was more concerned with making money and creating universally appealing stories rather than including Holocaust history or Jewish victims in their stories. So knowing the climate in America at the time, comics publishers avoided the subject until they felt the country was ready. And it wasn't until the early 1970s when some Americans were challenging the status quo with the civil rights movement and also the rise of ethnic diversity that stories about the Holocaust began to be told in more mainstream and popular comic books.
So they had to wait till the audience was there again, rather than lead. Speaking of audience, I do want to bring in some audience comments, thanking us for addressing this topic from viewers like Despina, who got her 13-year-old to watch with us this morning, and also to Mark, who said that he will be sharing this show with his students in the fall. So we're so happy that you're watching and that this is striking a chord with you. Eli, many years after the Holocaust, Joe Kubert, continued to push the envelope. He went even farther and was illustrating the Holocaust in his comic art in a number of ways. Take us through a couple of examples, please.
Sure. Joe Kubert is the most accomplished and honored so-called war comics illustrator of all time. And one of the series he worked on for DC was called Star-Spangled War Stories. And it featured stories from various wars throughout history. Many of the stories focused on World War II. And the series featured a character called the Unknown Soldier, whose face was wrapped in bandages because he had been injured in the war. And he was a brave U.S. military operative in the war after recovering. Joe Kubert drew the cover of this 1971 issue, which shows innocent civilians imprisoned behind barbed wire. It's striking in that there's barbed wire and a Nazi threatening, "You all die." It's 1971, and it's important to note that none of the figures is wearing a Star of David, nor is there anything else that identifies them on the cover or in the story as Jewish. One could surmise that they are, but you'd have to know something about the Holocaust to reach that conclusion. Not until the next year, 1972, would a major publisher, DC, in a story drawn by the great Neil Adams, at last depict systematic murder of Jews by the Nazis, something that Joe Kubert had done, as we saw in Challenger number 3, decades earlier. In this particular issue, the Unknown Soldier was tasked with rescuing an underground fighter, not a Jew, an underground fighter from the imaginary concentration camp Totentanz, which is German, I think, for dance of death. This particular series ran from 1952 to 77 and was later renamed The Unknown Soldier after its principal character.
What are we looking at here? I think this is an issue of Unknown Soldier from 1981, right?
That's right. 10 years later, here we see the Unknown Soldier, face still covered in bandages, among a pile of dead bodies on a cart. He's trying to keep a young girl quiet to help her escape Warsaw's Jewish ghetto without being caught and killed by the German soldiers you see right there. This cover is really emblematic of the extraordinary emotional power for which Joe Kubert's art remains renowned. And this particular cover evoked true stories from the Holocaust of mothers who desperately tried to keep their children quiet, sometimes, alas, with fatal consequences. And the German soldiers hovering nearby are explicitly revealing that only dead people leave the ghetto.
So in this case, Joe Kubert is going really far from an imaginary universe and bringing in very graphic, disturbing, and real details from real places, which I think offers a good transition to my next question for you, Samantha. Probably the most well-known comic rendition of the Holocaust comes from the son of a Holocaust survivor, artist Art Spiegelman. And we are grateful to Art Spiegelman for letting us show some of his drawings and art here today. He wrote and drew one of the most well-known graphic novels about the Holocaust, 2-volume series, which came out in the 80s and 90s, Mouse. For viewers who may not be familiar with Mouse or Art Spiegelman, who was he, who were his parents, and what is this project?
Spiegelman was born in Stockholm, Sweden in 1948 to Holocaust survivors Vladek and Anja Spiegelman. And here he is as a young boy with his parents. Spiegelman wrote a graphic memoir about his parents' Holocaust experiences. And because Spiegelman's mother committed suicide when he was only 20, he relied on his father's memories to create Mouse. As source material, Spiegelman did a lot of research, and he also looked toward Holocaust survivor Alfred Kantor, who had made drawings about the experiences and his observations in concentration camps. We see here the covers of Mouse 1 and 2. And this, again, it's a 2-volume work. It was released in 1986 and 1991. Spiegelman's parents were Polish Jews who survived the Auschwitz killing center. Spiegelman conveys their trauma and loss that they experienced using personified animals instead of people. So this bestiary of characters included Jewish people depicted as mice, Germans as cats, Americans as dogs, and so on. Hitler called Jews vermin. Portraying them as mice incorporated this pernicious Nazi ideology into the story. Spiegelman also incorporated 3 historical family photos, which makes it clear to the reader that the story is based on the lives of real people. Maus is really a 3-fold book. It's a story about Vladek's survival during the Holocaust, a story about the strenuous relationship between a father and son, and a story about the process of writing a graphic novel or graphic memoir about the Holocaust.
And those different levels, those layers that you're describing come through loud and clear. I remember when Maus came out, I was a teenager, the child of a Holocaust survivor who did not discuss his experiences during the Holocaust. And I remember it was painful to read because it is clearly wrenching. It was not an easy process. Samantha, many of our viewers may not yet have had the chance to read Maus, although I encourage them strongly to do so. Could you please take us through a couple of panels from the series to help them better understand how Spiegelman carried his family's Holocaust legacy and just how groundbreaking it was?
We are looking at a panel here. It's highly vertical from a larger page, and it captures the feeling of desperation that Art Spiegelman's parents felt when they attempted to escape a ghetto they were forced to live in. The paths ahead of them, as you can see, join to form an ominous giant swastika, which is a vivid symbol indicating that there was no escaping the Nazis, the feeling that no matter where they turned, it was a dead end. And in this, throughout the graphic memoir and the text, you will see that Art Spiegelman conveys his father's accent. Ultimately, his parents, they tried to escape occupied Poland, but they were betrayed and sent to Auschwitz.
And so after this stymied escape, the next panel that we're going to share takes us even further into the Spiegelman parents' Holocaust experiences. Show us what we're looking at here, please.
Here's a scene from Auschwitz where Vladek remembers his friend Mandelbaum, who he knew before the war. And the narrative boxes convey Vladek's voice. Mandelbaum, as you can see, he's sent to Auschwitz with Vladek. Vladek is resourceful and manages to survive. But in this panel, we can see Mandelbaum had a very difficult time and he dies in the camp. And we get a sense of this through Art Spiegelman's economy of line, this visual that's augmented by the text. And this panel and so many others, I really encourage readers to read this graphic memoir. These drawings are evocative and haunting, and the power of Spiegelman's art can be seen when looking at this panel alongside photographs of actual prisoners at Auschwitz.
He really is true to the historical details. As you mentioned, this is not fiction. We're used to calling comics graphic novels to give them more respect, to show they're more than the funnies, but this is a graphic memoir and a powerful representation. We can see even Mandelbaum's cap, as it's drawn, is a depiction, an accurate depiction of what prisoner camps looked like at camps like Auschwitz. What was the emotional toll, as we understand it from the book, that creating Maus had on Art Spiegelman and his father, Vladek?
What makes Maus so powerful is how raw and honest and human it is. It goes beyond a story in which the inhuman cruelties that Jewish people had to suffer are portrayed. It shows what it is like to have survived the unimaginable and what it is to have something that happened before you were born, something that you're not sure you truly understand, be so acutely present in your life. And we see this with this section of the last bit of Maus that we're showing. We're looking at the final 2 panels of the book and a drawn headstone. The panel shows Spiegelman's father both physically and emotionally drained by recounting his Holocaust experiences. And he actually died before Maus came out. In the final panel, Vladek mistakenly calls Spiegelman Rishu, which was the name of his first son who was killed during the Holocaust. The headstone at the bottom honors Art's parents with their lifespans inscribed. And underneath the stone, the younger Spiegelman signs his name and also provides the dates that span 13 years. Those are the years that it took him to create Maus, providing a glimpse into the personal devotion and emotional investment that he made to this project. Maus won a Pulitzer Prize in 1992, and to date, it's the only graphic novel ever to win.
But I think it certainly broke ground. It revealed what comic book fans have known for decades and decades, which is that this is not only a lighthearted art form, but something that is able and in some ways more effective than some others in taking on even the heaviest, even the most painful of topics. Eli, I'd like to, before we turn to you, just share a brief comment from a viewer named Allison. Allison writes that I attended the museum's Belfer conference for educators last week. This week, I'm sitting here with my 17-year-old and 15-year-old sons, who are both huge Marvel and DC Comics fans. Thank you for this. And I'd also like to thank Marvel and DC Comics for supporting our program by granting us permission to share their art with you here. So thank you. Eli, let's look at a location that Joe Kubert returned to again and again in his work. Could you tell our viewers a bit about the Warsaw Ghetto, please, and how then it comes to appear in Kubert's work?
So here we see Jews gathered in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1941, an early stage of their oppression. There were thousands of sealed ghettos created during the Holocaust by the Nazis to separate Jews from the rest of society prior to murdering them en masse, including the littlest children and the tiniest babies in this paroxysm of genocidal mania. The Warsaw Ghetto in occupied Poland imprisoned more than 400,000 Jews, packed inside a walled portion of the city that was only about a mile and a third, 1.3 square miles in area. The living conditions were beyond ghastly. The ghettos were overcrowded. Here you see children in the ghetto, but the ghettos were overcrowded, unsanitary, disease-ridden. Here's a child begging in the ghetto. The Jews there lacked food and clean water. It wasn't uncommon to see people, even young children, as we just saw, begging, dying, or even dead in the streets, or piled up on carts, as Joe Kubert depicted on that cover that we saw a few minutes ago.
So not necessarily obvious setting or obvious material for a comic, but in fact, it is the setting for one of Joe Kubert's most personal works, Yoel. Tell us about this graphic novel, please.
Joe Kubert created his graphic novel Yoel in 2011. Just near the end of his life, he died the following year. So I think he was, on this trajectory of grappling with the unimaginable. The story takes place in part in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942 and 43. The novel is the result of questions he had about what his life would have been like if his family hadn't escaped Poland years before the Holocaust began and found refuge in this country. Kubert described it as, quote, a work of fiction based on a nightmare of facts, close quote. In this extraordinary graphic novel, the 13-year-old Yoel, which was his Yiddish name, he narrates the story by documenting his imagined life in Warsaw Ghetto in his drawings. And in the story, while his talent appeals to the SS and thereby saves his life, his family is sent to Auschwitz and murdered there. Here's the cover of the novel Yoel. Notice the tattoo on a prisoner's arm, much like those that were forcibly inflicted on prisoners at Auschwitz. After Yoel in the story learns what happens to his family and other deportees, he joins a group of young people trying to convince ghetto inhabitants to participate in armed resistance, including, or alluding, I should say, to the actual April 1943 Warsaw Ghetto uprising, in which mostly unarmed Jews fended off a massively equipped German military force dedicated to their annihilation, fended them off for weeks, which was longer than some countries of Europe stood up to the Nazis.
It feels really appropriate that Joe Kubert used this device of the alter ego when so much of comics is about alternate realities, revenge fantasies, paths not taken, and he uses it here very effectively, but it's in contrast to Art Spiegelman, who was depicting his parents' real-life lived experiences. Let's hear again from artist Adam Kubert, Joe's son, who explains his father's motivation in creating Yoel and the artistic technique he used to engage readers and embody his message.
This is our history. This is what happened. Let's not let this happen again. Yoel was a story. I mean, that was more personal than prior. That was more or less a what if story. What if he grew up as a young cartoonist in the Warsaw Ghetto? It wasn't a true story, although it was based on fact. And it was something he wanted to experiment with and try. But when he was drawing Yoel, he decided to have the entire book drawn in pencil, printed and published in pencil, because he wanted an immediacy to seem as though Yoel, which is my dad's Jewish name, by the way, was drawing the book, and you were watching him draw it and explain things as the reader was reading the story. Which, just keeping it in pencil, it does look like a quick sketch. It looks like somebody just sat down and drew it, and you're there watching.
We have a comment from a viewer named Eric, who writes, "So much that I didn't know about the great Joe Kubert. I could not agree more. I'm ashamed to say I didn't know about him before this show, and I'm immersed in this topic, so we're very glad if we can spread awareness of his art and his legacy. Also would like to thank the Kubert School, which Joe Kubert created to teach cartooning and graphic art, and indeed both of his sons, Andy and Adam, are recognized artists in this form." Now, Samantha, the 1943 Warsaw Ghetto uprising that Eli described and that Kubert portrayed was also adapted in other comic works. Tell us a little more about the uprising and how the creators of Superman, Man of Steel, depicted in particular, adapted an iconic image taken in the spring of 1943.
The oppression of Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto and the uprising is portrayed in this issue of Superman, Man of Steel, which is from 1998. And a little more about the uprising because it's so vital to the Holocaust story. It's one of the largest moments where the Jews fought back. And this is because in the summer of 1942, with news of Germans shipping Jews from the ghettos to killing centers, it's seeping back to the inhabitants of the Warsaw Ghetto, which led to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And that was in April of 1943. It was a mere 750 starving Jews fought the German troops and the police who entered the ghetto to deport the remaining inhabitants. As Eli said, it took about a month for the Germans to quash the Jews' revolt. Of the more than 56,000 Jews who were captured, about 7,000 were shot and the remainder were deported to the camps. And this story is told in many different comics and in many different venues. We have now up the most well-known photograph taken after the resistance fighters were defeated by the Germans. This was a photograph taken by the Germans to show the Jews how they were round up. This young boy with his hands up, surrendering to the German troops, is iconic, really. He was caught, he was deported to a killing center. We don't know the identity of this young boy, but for some, he's come to represent the up to 1.5 million innocent children who were murdered during the Holocaust. What's interesting is that this photograph of the Warsaw Ghetto boy, which is in our collective consciousness, is played on by one of the artists of Superman, Man of Steel. That artist is John Bogdanov. He appropriates the image. It's a very horizontal panel. It features 5 Jewish victims from the photograph that we just saw. They are colored in more vivid hues than the nearly monochrome masses in the background. And they're uniformly shown in deep blues and grays. Bogdanov is really an expert with coloration and form. He has an inker, he has someone who colors for him, and he portrays 2 of the German soldiers as the far right as well. But 4 figures are given voices. The mother to the far left reassures her daughter, but in giving these doomed Jewish figure voices, he humanizes them and he conveys their plight.
And Samantha, the way you're describing Bogdanov's art, I think is really consistent with the discussion that's going on in the comments section right now. And I hope that the 2 of you will have a chance to look at this later. A debate about whether comics are, a great tool to teach history versus they're not historical fact. I think we see with comics, as with any other work of art related to the Holocaust or fiction, that it's a chance to also process difficult emotions, difficult material, to imagine, in this case, what might have been going through the heads of these people in this horrible moment that has been captured on film, and that it is a kind of side door. It may help people, I think, also to enter into a confrontation with what is otherwise and must remain horrifying reality and fact. We are almost out of time. So Eli, I'd like to kind of put you on the spot if I can embarrass you a little. Acclaimed author Jodi Picoult, who is also now writing about Wonder Woman in her latest artistic endeavor, has referred to you as a modern day superhero for your work over the last 4 decades to bring Nazis and their collaborators to justice. For a comic book fan like yourself, I can't imagine a better compliment. And I'm curious if reading about comic superheroes when you were a kid may have influenced any of your career choices.
Thanks, Edna. Of course, the superhero reference is way too generous, way over the top. But of course, I also appreciated it. Career influence, probably in some way. I was introduced to superheroes via Superman, specifically in the 1960s when they reran the great 1950s Superman TV series starring George Reeves. I came to that TV show and then the comics as a very young boy. And like many of us, grew up in a protective parental cocoon, right? The world is good, everything is fine, kind, and happy. So I came upon this just really around the time that I was beginning to realize that that's not the way the world is. There's a lot of evil, a lot of suffering, a lot of misfortune out there. And I think through the comics, I learned at a young age the lesson, again, monthly in the comics and 5 days a week through the adventures of Superman on TV, that good can defeat evil. And bringing things full circle, I would say that I'm privileged for 4 decades now to have been part of a Justice Department team that has continues to vanquish evil in our prosecutions of Nazi perpetrators as recently as last year, and participants in modern day human rights crimes from Rwanda to Bosnia to Ethiopia and beyond.
Well, Eli, we are so glad that you're out there with your colleagues fighting the good fight, even if your weapon is the law, the long arm of the law, rather than a right hook, if I can be a little corny. Samantha, I'd like to ask you a closing question too. Some may think, as we've just been discussing, that comics should be left to entertain readers rather than to educate them, especially about heavy or painful topics like the Holocaust. What are your thoughts on the effectiveness of comics to do both tasks?
As we've seen today, comics are not the superficial fluff that some make them out to be. Undoubtedly, comics are a vital and exciting medium to educate, and I do so in my classroom every single year at the university level. Comics are particularly appealing to younger people, and for many, again, they're more accessible and readable. And this important medium is well suited to tell stories about the Holocaust and other difficult social and historical material.
Well, we are really grateful that you do that, helping us also understand and peel back the many layers that may not be immediately obvious to the less trained eye. So thank you for that. We have a viewer named Mark who writes in, "Thank you so much for this program. My sons and their contemporaries are big into superheroes and they need to delve into this subject." So I want to thank you, Samantha. Thank you, Eli, for joining us today, sharing your contagious passion and insights about comics and the Holocaust.
Thanks, Edna.
Thank you
Thanks.
very much, Edna. It's been a pleasure.
We all learned a great deal about how this art form has the power and capacity to go far beyond entertainment, to tackle important topics and educate readers, maybe sometimes without them even realizing it. So the next time one of my kids asks for a comic book or to see the latest superhero movie, I will not hesitate. Viewers, we hope that you will join us for our next program. We're taking a little bit of a summer vacation, but please join us on Thursday, August 19th at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. When many of us think of the Holocaust, we immediately picture ghettos, as we discussed today, or gas chambers. But on August 19th, for World Photography Day, we'll be showing a collection of photos that demonstrate the rich lives of the residents of the Lithuanian town of Eišiškės. We'll explore 7 days in September 1941, after the Germans invaded Soviet territory, when Jewish community that had existed in that town for centuries was wiped out in the course of a week. Villagers were murdered by bullets at the hands of Germans and their local collaborators, and we have a photographic record of life in that town before that horrible time. So please join us on August 19th. Thank you again for being with us today. And until next time, stay safe and be well.